If you've ever been curious about what life would be like in 2062, have we got the cartoon for you? From talking robots to video calls and smartwatches, the Jetsons showed us a glimpse into the future. The famous Hanna-Barbera cartoon is one of those shows that everyone knows, but hardly anyone talks about. Yet, the iconic family of the future has been a part of pop culture for over 60 years. So today, we're covering the entire story of the Jetsons. Premiering in 1962, futurism and architecture inspired the new animated comedy. It was also the first cartoon to broadcast in color on ABC. Focusing on George Jetson and his family, wife Jane, daughter Judy, and son Elroy, the show explores a shockingly utopian future. Supported by Rosie the Robot, Astro the Dog, and Mr. Spacely, the show would become quite popular in reruns anyway. Everybody freaks out when they learn the Jetsons only had 24 episodes in its first season. It's true. If you watched it growing up, you most definitely watched the same episodes over and over again. An entire generation of kids grew up with George Jetson and his family through the magic of syndication. 20 years after season 1 ended, a new season arrived, this time in syndication. The show ran for an additional 51 episodes, had a legendary crossover with a certain Stone Age family, and even spawned a movie in 1990. So buckle up as we take a fantastic voyage into Orbit City. The Jetsons is kind of like the Flintstones of the future, even if it's a futuristic world with cultural values from the 1950s. Season 1, Episode 1, Rosie the Robot, introduces a vital character, the domestic robot, Rosie. The episode begins in a futuristic building. Inside, Jane Jetson is doing push-button exercises, guided by a TV host. Judy interrupts her mother to ask if she can go to the beach because apparently that's still a thing in Orbit City. The action switches to young Elroy, who's walking all over the walls thanks to his space boots. He tries to convince his mom to let him stay home from school, but she won't let him and makes him breakfast with the help of a neat little meal generator. I guess those push-button exercises are being put to good use. Jane realizes George isn't awake yet, so she uses a fancy schmancy ejector machine to pop him straight out of bed. George grumbles about waking up while Jane and Elroy deal with a broken breakfast machine. We see some automated contraptions taking care of George before Elroy gets launched off to school. At breakfast, George whines about the quality of his meal as Jane tells him their machine broke down. Now George must get a new one. It's pricey though. Jane wants some new housework machines. On a video call, her mom suggests getting a robot maid. She heads to the shop, but they need references before allowing a rental. Luckily, mentioning her mom leads to instant service. We meet several robot models as Rosie enters the scene. She's a bit run down, but has plenty of attitude.
I may be homely, Buster, but I'm S-M-A-R-T smart.
Back at the Jetson home, Rosie cleans the house, plays catch with Elroy, and tutors Judy. She's like ChatGPT before that was even a thing. At work, George insists on a raise. Spacely, who wants a decent home-cooked meal, agrees on one condition. If Jane makes him dinner, George agrees. When he gets home, he ignores Rosie, gets a free back massage, and gripes about his easy job. He freaks out when he finally sees her and acts like a brat. When George discovers Mr. Spacely intends to come over for dinner, she and George go into panic mode. They only have leftovers in the house. Luckily, Rosie is there to save the day by whipping up a special meal. Spacely arrives, says some bigoted things to Judy, and is eager to have dinner with the Jetson family. Rosie puts out a delicious meal, which Jane calls filet of leftovers. When he discovers Rosie made it, he gets, but Rosie's having none of it and smashes an upside-down cake over his head. Spacely fires George. Rosie says a tearful goodbye, but the boss suddenly calls back. He's changed his mind and wants to bring George back with more pay. Why? So she can cook more delicious meals for Spacely to eat in the future. Spoiler, he never does. George catches up with Rosie and brings her home, adding another member to the Jetson clan. She certainly won't be the last. Episode 4 of Season 1, The Space Car, opens with a wide shot of George Jetson fast asleep and ignoring his alarm clock. He gets up and into his morning routine. After accidentally having it style his hair like Jane's, he finds some time to yell at his son for flying a jetpack in the house. But Elroy reminds him they're buying a new car today. Jane gets a phone call from a friend and dons a mask that she calls her morning face. George watches the news and learns about an escaped prisoner. He comments that he'd hate to run into that guy. But guess what happens next? The prisoner, Knuckles Nuclear, robs a bank and escapes in his flying car. It turns out that he used a gun to turn the guards into babies. Well, they don't turn into actual babies, they just act like them. Now on the run, they seek a hideout and land. Where else? In the Jetsons' garage. The criminals decide not to steal their car, but Jane and George walk by them. The building's handyman, Mr. Orbit, meets them and learns about their plan to get a new car. Naturally, he mocks the married couple and complains how cars aren't made like they used to.
It's a real steal, Mr. Jetson.
He also shows them an antique car he's been working on that somehow still works in 2062. The Jetsons unknowingly hop into the robber's car before heading out. They travel to the dealership as George makes a big deal about how Jane can't drive. George mansplains it to her while shenanigans ensue. She misses a turn, smashing through an office window. She lets George take over driving just as a policeman pulls them over and makes him talk to the judge there and then on a screen. It's a good thing the judge is a lot easier on people since he got a product sponsor.
I use Come Clean, the spot remover with the applicator top.
I guess in the future, they can smack ads on everything. A call comes over the radio warning police that a man and woman in a beat-up car just robbed a bank, and the cop immediately believes that the Jetson couple are the suspects. We rejoin Jane and George flying their beat-up car. She questions why there's a gun in the car and is he sure this is their car? He dismisses her concern, and they arrive at the dealership. A greedy salesman sees them as an easy mark and shows them a fun training film all about how they make the cars. This includes several models, even one with a special seat.
Is this seat for the mother-in-law?
Look out for that truck up ahead!
Wow, where can I get one of these from? Jane wants a new car. The salesman finds the big bag of bank cash in the back of their car and makes a deal. You know it's a lot of money because the bag has a giant dollar sign on it. The Jetsons head home, still driving the stolen car containing the giant sack of cash. Back at the Jetsons' garage, Knuckles Nuclear interrogates the handyman over who took his car. While outside, the police wait for the Jetsons to return home. They go through the classic come out with their hands up spiel as Jane and George arrive. Knuckles and his girl meet them when they pull in. George returns the money and car and somehow holds the criminals at gunpoint. When the police storm in, they declare George a hero. George, of course, passes out from all the excitement. As the episode draws to a close, Jane drives the new car home, but this time George seems oddly cool with it. His secret? He's wearing a blindfold. I guess ignorance is bliss. The Jetsons have some pretty iconic characters, but it might surprise you to learn that one of the best, Astro, didn't even show until 5 episodes into the series. The Coming of Astro begins with Jane going to a hair appointment. Pierre gives her a series of goofy hairstyles that ends in her original hairstyle anyway. She thinks it's great and heads home. Elroy shows up with a large gray dog in hand and introduces his new baby puppy dog to his mom. Just like Scooby-Doo after downing a delicious Scooby snack, Astro talks to the family and does some other tricks too. This convinces Jane to let him stay. At work, George receives a video call from his wife, and naturally, complains that she might want something. Jane explains her case by barking at him. Seems like an effective means of communication. Finally, she explains that the kids found a dog and want to keep him, but George says no. After the call, George uses the computer to figure out his predicament. It tells him to buy an electric dog. So he heads off to buy a nuclear-powered, trouble-free electronic dog named Electronimo.
Fetch.
A few flashy tricks and one fast-talking salesman later, and George is on his way home with a dog that prefers wattage to walkies any day. At the apartment, Jane hides Astro until they can convince Dad to let him stay. George gets home and shows off the nuclear-powered, apartment-approved dog. The reception is tepid at best. The robot dog soon finds Astro, who George is not happy to see. This reaction causes Astro to cry while Jane chews out George over his behavior. The family points out all the tricks he can do. How can you say no to that? George doesn't care. Astro has to go. He attempts to kick the dog out, gets locked out of the apartment, but the family finally convinces him to have both pooches compete for his love. George puts the pets through a series of tasks, fetching slippers and finding a bone. Electronimo wins, but Astro somehow tricks George into leaving, if only for a moment. Jane convinces him to let the dog stay the night, and a tearful Elroy bids him goodnight. While in bed, George tries to justify his decision, but angers his wife instead. As they snooze, a cat burglar flies toward their apartment. Electronimo startles the burglar and he runs directly into George. The burglar escapes by switching out his mask and fooling the robot dog. He ends up outside, where the cops mistake him for the criminal. Inside, Elroy convinces a lazy Astro to capture the real burglar, which he accidentally pulls off. The police officer brings their father back inside, and all is well. Astro joins the family and licks George's face affectionately for the first of many times. Season 1, Episode 7, The Flying Suit, takes the futuristic family on a mighty adventure. The episode starts with George going to his job at Spacely Space Sprockets. As he makes his way to his station, he wonders if he can have the afternoon off. Apparently, 3-day work weeks are too much for workers of the future. He roams around the office until he gets into a meeting with a drowsy Mr. Spacely. The boss is grouchy and tells Jetson to get back to work. Spacely's nemesis, Cogswell, visits the factory to set up a merger, but it's a surprise visit. Things end in a stalemate, but George's boss is worried. It turns out, Cogswell created a fancy, high-tech flight suit, the X-1500. Okay, that's pretty cool. The suit impresses Cogswell and wants to roll it out for a demonstration.
Amazing! Amazing!
After his shift, George is mad that Spacely wouldn't give him the afternoon off. His wife calls, telling him to swing by the cleaners to pick up his suit, and in typical George fashion, he whines about it. But after a mix-up occurs at the dry cleaners, George is given the flying suit by mistake. Of course, it looks exactly like his normal suit, so George takes it home and puts it on. Shortly after, Elroy forces him into trying his newest invention, a flying pill. Suddenly, he finds himself airborne, believing that the pill was making him fly. When he's done playing in the sky, he shows his new powers off to his family. George thinks it'll help him avoid work by capitalizing on his son's flying pills. Excited, he flies to work where he and his boss discuss the magic of Elroy's pills. Spacely rides George's back as he flies through the office and around the building. And wouldn't you believe, his plan's working, as the boss promotes him. George flies home to make more pills and cash in on his son's unbelievable invention. During an investors meeting at Cogswell's, it's revealed the flying suit doesn't work. Following a few unsuccessful tests, he admits the suit was a failure. The tester takes it to the laundromat, where the cleaner realizes he gave George the wrong suit and returns it to the rightful owner. George eagerly dons the suit, which is now his original one, and takes Elroy's pills back to the plant. But something's wrong. The pills no longer grant the power of flight. Now disheartened, George returns to work and frantically tries to explain the pills won't work. Ignoring him, Spacely takes some pills and immediately proceeds to not fly. Despite crashing into a wall and ignoring George's protests, he jumps out a window. Yikes, not the best decision. Jetson rescues his boss, explains the whole deal, and gets fired. Again. Season 1, Episode 11 introduces a rarely used yet important character, Grandpa Jetson. We open with someone doing some tricks and speeding in his car. The cops stop him, thinking he's a teenager, but are surprised when it turns out he's an older gentleman. He's 110 years old, but has the energy of a teenager. Sadly, he forgot his license, but the cops let him off with a warning, so long as he doesn't do any tricks. How nice.
110, and still acting like a man of 75.
Grandpa Jetson, whose name is Montague, stops to help an older lady, but hits on her before heading to the Jetson home. At the Jetsons' apartment, George and Elroy are getting things ready for Grandpa's visit by setting up a fancy rocking chair for him. A few minutes later, Grandpa shows up. He greets everyone and immediately starts showing off.
Grandpa!
Grandpa Jetson!
He plays baseball with Elroy and goes bowling with George, but leaves everyone exhausted. Back at home, George whines about how he can't keep up with Grandpa, but Jane isn't concerned and says she's going to go sky surfing with him the following day. But Jane is in for a surprise when Grandpa does all sorts of crazy tricks on the trip, It's too much for her too. So the family hatches a new plan. Use Astro to exhaust Grandpa. Wow. If they put as much effort into building a better society as they do in trying to bring down an old man's spirits, they could make the future a much better place. Anyway, Grandpa and Astro play fetch in the park, but attract the attention of the cop from the beginning of the episode. He lets them off with a warning, again, and tells Grandpa to stay off his beat.
Please stay off my beat.
Grandpa roams around the park, Astro in tow, where he makes friends with a young mother named Celeste. He volunteers to babysit for her while she and her husband go on a trip. Apparently, leaving your baby in the care of someone you just met in the park was perfectly acceptable in the 1960s. Judy is watching him from the car, sees her give him a kiss on the cheek, and runs home to tell Mommy. In the apartment, Jane overhears Grandpa trying to buy a license over the phone. Not realizing it's a license for Astro, she thinks it's so he can get married. Now, it's meddling time. The older woman he helped at the beginning shows up at the Jetson home. Jane thinks this is the woman he's trying to marry. Celeste calls and cancels the babysitting gig. This makes Judy think Grandpa and his girlfriend have a baby, but she doesn't tell him. Grandpa shows up to Celeste's apartment and picks up the baby. Uh-oh, accidental kidnapping. The same cop from earlier pulls him over, again, but lets him off. When the bulletin about the kidnapping comes over the radio, he knows exactly who to arrest. Back at the Jetson home, Grandpa clears up the confusion with the family, finds out he accidentally kidnapped a baby, and laughs it off. The angry cop finally tries to arrest him, but they love him, so he faces 0 consequences, and he flies off into the distance, doing more tricks along the way. The episode Miss Solar System offers a Jane-centric story. Jane spins through a few looks before landing on a flashy Martian dress. She shows it off to her friend Gloria, who seems dazzled by its flashing lights. In the other room, George and Elroy are watching TV when an Ed Sullivan ripoff show comes on the tube. It's all about the Miss Solar System competition. George gets way too excited about seeing Miss Jupiter in 3D and discovers the sponsor is none other than Spacely Sprockets. Naturally, George is glued to the show. He's in a trance as Jane tries to get his attention with her new dress, and calling her Gina doesn't help his case. She becomes increasingly annoyed as she tries to show off. Being oblivious turns to pain when she wedges a vase on his head in frustration, but he continues to hoot and holler at the TV while ogling Miss Jupiter. Annoyed by his indifference, Jane enters the Miss Solar System competition just to spite him. She submits a risque Instagram-style pic to the committee and, to her surprise, gets into the pageant. She enters it to spite George. Shh, it's a secret. At the office, Mr. Spacely acts thrilled to be sponsoring the Miss Solar System pageant. He puts George in charge of things so he can be a creep without being distracted. But there's a problem. He already bought theater tickets. Since she canceled, he takes his boss up on the offer to run the beauty contest. Fast forward to the pageant itself, which takes place in a flashy building bathed in colorful spotlights. Gina Jupiter greets everyone with her best Joan Rivers impression, and we meet our anonymous and disguised judge, Mr. Spacely. His wife sees through the facade, however, calling him a worm and dragging him off to who knows where. George becomes the mystery judge as the pageant begins. Each girl is introduced with an increasingly excited George shouting stuff that would get him canceled today. Let's just say, George likes the ladies. By the time they introduce Jane, he's over the top. He even says she's a great pair of molecules.
Duper! That's what I'd call a well-grouped flock of molecules.
I'd hope so, dude. You know, she being your wife and all. The talent contest begins with each of the girls doing something kind of lame. Ms. Saturn recites Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and Ms. Mars plays a silly concerto. Finally, Jane, or Wiz Western Hemisphere, sings a rock and roll song. Groovy. George, still blissfully unaware that she's his wife, is super impressed. She's the clear winner and claims her prize. In a classic move straight out of a cheesy rom-com, the two realize they're husband and wife, and Jane is disqualified. But Jane's the true winner, as George rips up his picture of Gina and declares his love for his wife. Season 2, Episode 1 marks another Jetson milestone, the introduction of a new character, Orbity. Orbity is a bizarre alien creature voiced by Frank Welker, who brings the show straight into the 80s. We open with Elroy missing during a school field trip to the moon. He finds some moon rocks, including one that moves, and returns to the bus. At the Jetson home, Jane and George are enjoying 3D TV when Elroy gets home from school, being dragged in by Rosie the Robot. Astro notices the weird rock and tries to bury it. Jane puts him in bed and plays a fancy hologram program to get him to go to sleep. When everyone's deep in slumber, the rock sprouts springy legs and hops away. The dog notices this creature and wakes Elroy. Elroy watches the rock hatch into a strange, furry creature. The creature introduces itself as Orbity and settles in to rest with Elroy. In the morning, George gets upset with all his fancy future tech not working right. The culprit? Orbity. The cute little creature bounces around and shows love for the family, but George isn't having it and tries to get rid of it. Fails miserably. Rosie mistakes the alien for a rag. Astro runs and hides, and everyone else trembles in fear. I mean, I get it. I would be scared of an alien pom-pom bouncing all around the house too. By the time Elroy explains things, the entire family is scared. Afterward, George does some research with a digital encyclopedia. It has no idea what he's talking about, but eventually identifies Orbity as a color-changing asteroid alien that hasn't been seen in 650 years. Afterward, he's delighted to find that the adorable asteroid alien has fixed his TV. As the family sits down to lunch, the family finds out the alien likes to eat dog food. Orbity continues to hop around, and Astro gets jealous of all the attention the little fluff ball is getting and runs away. The family doesn't seem to care much, with George saying that Astro can take care of himself. Ouch, pretty cold, man. But wouldn't you know it, the dog is almost immediately picked up by a dog catcher. Elroy is worried, but George doesn't care. In a heart-to-heart conversation with Orbity, the boy vows to find his dog, and naturally, the tiny spring-loaded alien knows how. They use the alien's color-changing abilities to track Astro and find him immediately. Elroy explains that Orbity helped find him, and Astro is quick to forgive. They eventually bust him loose and a chase ensues, with the dog catcher insisting Astro must return to the pound. Some cunning and a well-placed button press help them trap the dog catcher in his own ship. Safely back at the apartment, George allows Orbity into the family. The alien, who suddenly feeling sad, jumps into an exit tube. Surprise! He returns almost immediately and expresses his love for everyone, especially Astro. Now, that's a sweet ending. If I was like Orbity, I'd be turning pink right now. Season 2, Episode 4, Judy's Birthday Surprise, does something rare for a Jetsons episode by focusing on the daughter of the clan. Judy has a problem. She can't find her diary. She eventually finds it in a hat box after trying a few other places, revealing that this is no ordinary diary. It's a floating heart with a pair of lips and an antenna protruding from the top. The diary, which she calls Di, seems annoyed about the story she's going to tell. In a flashback, Judy drives a car and she runs into an old friend, flying with a jetpack. Her car breaks down and no one will stop to help her. Mr. Jetpack is a no-go, and a dude in a yellow car wishes her good luck. Finally, a weird young man in green named Curly Quasar comes to the rescue. I guess chivalry isn't completely dead in 2062. She doesn't know him, but he knows her. He figures the problem. She was out of fuel pellets. Judy doesn't understand. She thinks it could have something to do with getting a perm for a birthday party. Ah yes, the perm problem that's listed in all good flying car manuals. She thanks Curly for his help, but leaves him in the dust. The next day, Elroy works on a secret project, which upsets Judy for some reason. She gets her way when George tells him to take his project to her room. Judy drops some less than subtle hints about her birthday party, but George doesn't comprehend. It looks like the parents have zero plans to throw her a party, but Judy is convinced they will. The diary is sick of listening to her at this point, but she continues anyway. Judy contemplates her friendships with various boys, but is shocked when they all tell her they're busy on Saturday night. She sees her parents' outfits for Saturday night, and it finally dawns on her. They're not planning a party at all. Defiant as ever, she goes out anyway. But there's some bad news. No one's available because of a big party. She finally takes a call from Curly, complaining about not having a party or any available friends. But she's super happy when he shows up with a present for her. It turns out Judy likes him now, so he asks her out. She says yes, but is still upset about the party. But what's this? A flying birthday cake? It turns out, her parents threw a party for her after all, and invited all her friends. In the end, she sticks with Curly Quasar, planting a big kiss on his face. The episode ends with her blowing out the candles, as Astro wishes her a Happy Roof Day! This pooch has to be a relative of Scooby-Doo. Season 2, Episode 7 starts with a lousy situation, a broken down car. The distressed Jetson hops on the bus, where he's greeted by a surly bus driver. Inside, an AI interface demands cash, but seeing as he doesn't have any, it steals his watch instead. The bus ride is no picnic, but it puts him in touch with a wacky inventor who has a magic device that can rewind time, dubbed the Replayola. He explains further as George asks a series of skeptical questions before trying it out. It works well enough to get him back to the platform and board the bus a second time. Rewinding makes a big difference. Now, the bus driver is much nicer. The machine works, and he learns he can erase people. Don't worry, they still exist somewhere in the fabric of reality. George doesn't have to think twice about buying the device and heads home. As he walks in, his family is less than enthusiastic to see him. The fix? Replayola. Excited about his new toy, he reveals the device to his family. He discusses some hypothetical scenarios with Jane before getting ready for a big speech. But Elroy reminds him, he's an awful public speaker. No matter, he has a fancy time-traveling doohickey that'll fix that right up. At the apartment meeting, George gives a lousy speech. Bunky gives a better one. But Mr. Jetson doesn't like anyone upstaging him, so he uses the device to upstage Bunky. With a smug look on his face, he takes the stage and a much better speech. Jane congratulates him for being an ass and a cigar-chomping, white-haired politician showing up to convince him to enter politics. George commits a few financial crimes with the help of his time-altering toy. Not enough money? No problem, just add a few zeros to your last deposit. Still not enough cash? Just keep replaying a meeting with the boss until you get a raise. Still a bit short? Cheat at the stock market. After committing a bunch of security fraud, Jane and George are dressed to the nines and heading to the governor's party. But things don't go well. Mr. Balding Politician insults the Jetson family and kicks them out. Things are going well for the Jetson family, but George is still acting jealous over Bunky, so he does something perfectly reasonable and erases the entire date. When he's done, he looks for Jane, only to discover he's not married and doesn't have any kids at all. And that's why you don't mess with time travel. Yeah, that's a pretty hefty mess up right there. If only he had something he could use to fix the problem. So he does what any reasonable person who messed up their timeline would do. Visits his former wife. She answers, but barely recognizes him. Demonstrating zero knowledge of how altering time streams work, George can't comprehend that the two are married. Now moping about in the rain, it finally dawns on him. He can use the device to do some timey-wimey stuff and go back to the day he got it. It works, and the inventor gives him an out. If he returns the device to the inventor, it'll undo everything. It works, and George gets what's coming to him. Angry bus passengers, a frosty reception from his family, and a very happy dog. But there's some good news. They canceled the neighborhood meeting. But Bunky still comes over for dinner. Season 2, Episode 8, Fugitive Fleas, opens with Jane going to the beauty shop, where she's spending dollars. George calls her, excited about his raise. Naturally, Jane spends his money immediately to get the works. She spent the money too soon, however, as George receives a call that his raise has been canceled. But at least Spacely gives him some free tickets to a carnival on Pleasure Planet. What a deal! Back at home, Jane shows off her new look while George freaks out over his lost money. The family thinks it stinks, but at least Orbity is excited. But of course, they don't take him along. At Pleasure Planet, they go down a green tube, play some bumper cars, and eventually check out Solarini's Moonflea Circus. Sadly, there are no dogs allowed. Inside the flea circus tent, the Jetsons are treated to a performance of the fleas riding a trapeze and general circusy things. After the show, the family gushes over the fleas and Solarini's training. But it turns out the carnival barker is actually a jerk and mistreats the fleas. After enjoying their day out, the Jetsons go home. But it turns out some hitchhikers stowed away on Astro, the fleas. They explain their predicament to young Elroy, who apparently understands the flea language. The fleas don't like George, and he threatens to kick them out. Orbity thinks they should be allowed to stay, as does the rest of the family. In the morning, Rosie tries to get rid of the fleas, but the family has decided to let them stay. Suddenly, Solarini shows up at the apartment, demanding his fleas be returned. An argument breaks out, with George offering to buy the fleas instead of returning them. The family pulls out a wad of cash together. They still use cash in the future? And send the portly flea master on his way. But the Jetsons are about to have another visitor when an agent suddenly turns up and lets himself in. He offers the Moon Fleas a deal to get them on TV. Because fleas are just as eager for stardom as the average musician, they agree. Later that night, the Jetson family is watching TV when their flea friends come on the tube. Everyone seems to be enjoying the show, dancing and carrying on to the worst new wave music you've ever heard. But the next morning, it seems the fleas return to Astro's hide because they miss the Jetsons and like them better than stardom. Season 2, episode 16 ventures into more sci-fi territory with the Mirrormorph. The action opens with Judy making a sculpture of Astro, using a machine. She's excited that the artwork the machine made for her will help her in school. That sounds like cheating to me. But the clay isn't of high quality and her sculpture breaks. But all is not lost, because she's about to get something in the mail. Elsewhere, some scientists receive a package of what they think is a metamorph in the mail. They seem excited at first, until they realize that it's completely inert. It turns out, at the post office, the sorting robot mixed up Judy's package with a Science Institute's package. Back at the Jetson home, Judy receives her package and excitedly unwraps it. She thinks it's cosmic clay, but it's something else entirely. It turns out the clay turned into a perfect clone of Judy. The real one continues to get ready for a date. Her date proceeds to hit on her mom before meeting the Judy clone. The clone ends up on a date with a guy, Benny, whose hairstyle resembles a court jester. They go to a museum to experience some high-tech sculptures. But Judy's attention doesn't stretch very much because they finish checking out the museum. She messes up a painting, so Benny breaks up with her.
That painting you ruined is gonna cost.
The real Judy has no idea that the date already happened. She dumps Benny and heads inside, complaining to her parents about the boy. The Judy clone turns back into clay, and it doesn't take long for George to run into it.
Jane, it's been a space age since you brought me breakfast in bed.
It transforms into a clone, meets with Jane, and takes on her appearance. This goes on for a while, with it eventually taking the form of Orbity and Mr. Spacely. As the boss, the creature gets George fired for the 50th time. On the way home, he gets a ticket for hitting a cop with a metamorphic clay. The clay takes on the cop's form and runs off. George's family comes to pick him up, but he seems confused that they bought a new car. Apparently, he told Jane she could buy one, although it was actually his clone that made the decision. When they finally get back to the apartment, everyone is confused about all these strange things that have been going on. Later, the same cop, you remember the cop that touched the clay, right? Pulls Mr. Cogswell over and takes on his form. This is getting messy. The Mr. Cogswell clone meets with the currently unemployed George, who informs him he's now a free agent and can work for him, and the clone gives him a job. But the real Cogswell has no clue what's going on. George tries to start his new job, but the clay keeps changing form and steals a prototype from Cogswell. Thankfully, the scientists, whom we haven't seen since the beginning, finally catch up to the Mirrormorph's trail. The Mirrormorph suddenly starts multiplying, and the group steals George's car. Apparently, they're from Mercury and just wanted to go home. But it's not all bad though. The scientists congratulate George for saving the Earth from alien invasion. Huh? This is the first time we've heard anything about this. He gets his job back, gets a big fat raise, and offers to buy his wife a car. But his wife might actually be Mirrormorph herself. Spoiler alert, she isn't. Season 2, episode 19 is all about major malfunctions. The trouble begins with George sitting in a spaceship, begging Mr. Spacely to give him another chance. The episode just started, and he's been fired again? We've heard of incompetence, but sheesh. Mr. Spacely doesn't do things the normal way. Instead, he plans to ship Jetson off to Mongolia. But being the kind man he is, the boss gives George another chance. With things resolved for the time being, George heads home, ready to tell his family some bad news. At home, George meets with his family and constantly complains about giving them bad news. At dinner, he tells them they're moving to Outer Mongolia. It turns out Spacey wanted to get in with a bunch of rich fat cats. He pitches the idea of a relaxing workplace that's like a cross between a spa and a strip club. They, of course, go for it. But George has to figure out how to make it work. The company AI, Rudy, is under a lot of pressure from the boss to make his dream a reality. George and Rudy try to make the executive perks program work, But things start going off the rails pretty quickly. Rudy overloads and goes offline. Mr. Spacely is annoyed about it and decides George is on his own to set up a demonstration. George might be completely unqualified and inept, but his son has a solution to their problem. Elroy hooks his computer up to George's office modem, yes, a modem, and gets to work. He writes a new master program, confuses his family, and makes contact with Rudy. He spouts off a bunch of technical mumbo-jumbo and promises it'll help George at work. Elroy's work pays off and George is able to finish the project. His success impresses the bigwigs, who immediately start enjoying perks like artificial tans. Everything is going great until Rudy breaks down again. Instead of being a spa, the program now drops people onto the floor, soaks them in hot water, and force feeds them fancy food. The last part doesn't sound too bad. Mr. Spacely, now ruined, fires George again. As the Jetson family prepares to move away, Spacely bullies Rudy into threatening a meltdown. Meanwhile, the Jetsons have settled into their new home on a different planet. But lucky for them, George's boss comes back and begs him to return to work. He agrees, and the two convince Rudy to stop the meltdown with a brand spanking new program. Season 2, episode 22 takes a turn for the weird, but starts normal enough with George stuck in traffic. When he gets home, he breaks up a date between Judy and her rocker boyfriend. Dancing is a no-no. It's just like Footloose, but in the future. He gets her inside just in time to hear the new neighbors playing their incredibly loud drums. Later, Elroy is watching TV when he sees an ad for Countryside Living. He decides it's the life for him when he discovers the company does all the work for him. He goes about his day in typical George fashion. Daydreaming, whining about work, the usual stuff. But there's a trouble a brewing. Due to some Martian sprockets taking over the industry, George gets laid off for 6 months. He decides the family is moving. The family packs up and heads to their new home, Planetoid Paradiso. They meet a family of folks who can't understand why anyone would want to go there. The trip resumes, but there's a snag. George forgot to fill up the tank before they left, so they're forced to land on an asteroid. They build a tent by pushing a button, of course, but it gets smashed by a big tractor. It's okay. George will fix it later. With Elroy's help, he tries to set up a garden, but completely messes things up by pouring oil all over the field. The family tries to be resourceful by traveling through the jungle and discovering asteroid apricots before arriving at a treehouse. They spend a few months there eating nothing but apricot-based dishes before George gets whiny and tries to find new food. But he fails. Again. Above the asteroid, however, a development corporation is seeking new land. Concerned they'll lose investors, they try a drastic program, developing Paradiso. The company, Digifarm, admits to scamming George before heading down to the planet to develop it. They deliver the development news to George, who doesn't take it very well. Digifarm builds a high school, playground, a grocery store, and a marina. George misses the asteroid apricots and isn't happy about neighbors appearing. Unfortunately, the apricot trees are now extinct, and the drummer guy from their old apartment just moved in next door. So George and family head back to Earth. He gets his job back and happily returns to work at double the salary. His new assignment? On Planet Paradiso. Where else? Season 2, episode 30 sees the Jetson family taking a much-needed vacation. From what? We couldn't say. George is hard at work pushing buttons. He complains about how long he has to spend working until he finally gets to leave. He gets stuck in traffic, develops a severe case of road rage, and finally gets home. Worse for wear and in a grouchy mood. At home, the family watches game shows. Suddenly, Jane gets a call from the host, Gus Gesser. If they answer 2 questions correctly, they win a mystery prize. Rosie easily answers the first one. Makes sense, it was a math question. The second answer turns out to be the same as the dog's name, and they win a weekend rocket cruise. When George enters the room, he gets snippy with his wife, complains a little, and when she tells him the good news, bitches about her not cooking his dinner. When she tells him it's a vacation for the whole family, he changes his tune. Sadly, they have to put Astro in a kennel while they're gone. But not to worry, Elroy's gonna sneak him aboard the rocket ship inside a suitcase. What could go wrong? The family boards the Love Rocket, and that's its actual name, and it takes off. Judy and Elroy debate hiding Astro before George shows up wanting to jog. The family enjoys the cruise. Jane runs into her ex-rock star, Boy, but she's not the only one finding lost love on the ship. George runs into his former girlfriend, Sally, now the ship's activities director. She's obsessed with him and tries to steal a kiss. Elroy sees it and panics. Jane's ex comes on a little stronger by trying to get her to dump George. Of course, Judy witnesses everything, so she and Elroy try to save their marriage. Elroy dresses up as JB, the big video producer, attempting to get Sally to stay in her cabin for the rest of the trip, but it doesn't work. Judy, on the other hand, tries to flirt with Boy Boy, who is singing songs about her mother. This is getting weird. Sally meets George in the hallway, trying to kiss him again. The annoying musician ambushes Jane in the hallway, but she runs away. There seems to be no escape from Sally and Boy Boy, so they trap them in a life pod where they fall in love for each other. With a major conflict out of the way, the Jetsons attend a costume party where Astro wins the costume contest. Back at home, Elroy receives another call from Galaxy Guesser and wins a second weekend cruise on the Love Rocket. Oh no, not again. In Season 2, Episode 32, the Jetsons go full-on 80s sci-fi, and this time it's all about Jane. It all starts with George taking another afternoon off. I swear, this guy gets more time off than a doctor during golf season. He's thrilled to go home and see his family. When he arrives, he's shocked to learn everyone has a social life. It turns out that Jane and Judy went shopping and they buy a ton of stuff, including some totally radical and super cool sunglasses. In a scene straight out of the Twilight Zone, the alien seller gives her an ominous warning that she'll see life in a different way, but the glasses are just too cute, so she buys them anyway and takes her treasures home. When George sees the ugly suit she bought him, he's less than thrilled. They argue over money while Jane shows off all the ugly junk she bought at the space market. Wearing her new glasses, she sees Rosie trip and fall, but no one knows what she's talking about. Then it actually happens. George still doesn't believe her until she sees their car get smashed by a semi. Now, he believes her. They test the glasses a bit more. George comes out with a green lampshade on his head, Elroy juggles bananas while riding his dog's shoulder, and Judy comes out with a panda, all of which Jane saw before they happen. The couple goes out again to test the device outside before deciding to use their new toy to cheat at horse racing. Greedy George Jetson gets excited at the prospect of winning with his wife's future-predicting tech. It works, but they catch the attention of security. Like a gambler on a hot streak, they keep going until they win $200,000. This, of course, attracts the attention of some thugs. The couple uses a fellow gambler's clothes to disguise themselves as they make an escape from the racetrack. In their haste, they smash the magic glasses. Luckily, the Jetsons make it back to their car, where they're pursued by the thugs. When they get home, they celebrate their earnings, but it's short-lived when the thugs show up. But here's the twist. They're from the IRS. George pays his dues and only gets $2 measly bucks for his trouble. Afterward, Jane buys everyone glasses, and wouldn't you know it, they all have special powers. George can see the past, Judy's got X-ray specs, and Jane's making everyone look elderly. Well, you know what they say, nothing brings family together quite like terrible gifts. On the heels of a long syndication run, Season 3, Episode 1 makes a mockery of organized crime. In his home office, did the Jetsons predict remote work too? George is working on a mountain of paperwork. Of course, it's too much for him. Typical George. He's too busy to even spend time with his son. Elroy watches TV instead. On the tube, he stumbles across a heist in progress. Some gangsters are robbing Cogswell Cogs. They tell the police that the criminal, known as the Gridfather, is planning a heist, but they don't believe him. So George does the next best thing and tells his boss instead. Being the little, selfish man he is, Mr. Spacely doesn't care. Why would he? It's not his business. George has no clue what to do. Luckily, his family convinces him to do the right thing and tell Mr. Cogswell about the planned crime. Cogswell thinks George is scamming him and tells him to kick rocks. Back at the apartment, Elroy is distraught that no one believes him. So he tracks down the Gridfather to Cogswell's factory. The Gridfather and his thugs watch him land and declare they're gonna take care of him. George shows up and Elroy opens the factory door, but it's not long until Cogswell robots show up and get them arrested. Seeing this, the real criminals flee the scene. For all his trouble, George ends up in jail and facing some serious charges. So now Elroy and the family have a new mission: prove the Gridfather was truly responsible for the heist. Meanwhile, the criminal and his pals spring George from his cell, making him public enemy number 1. Afterward, they try to rob the Spacely Sprockets factory, setting up George as the fall guy. Jane enlists Mr. Spacely's help, or at least she tries. But her failure leads to her coming up with a scheme: get hired as an employee. She randomly pushes buttons on George's console, most of which offer naps or snacks, and speaks with the company's AI Rudy. He feels bad for George and wants to help. Together, they set a trap for the real criminals. The robots inside Spacely's factory catch a goon, but not the Gridfather. Jane sends a sweater, though, to the robot, who uses it to tether the Gridfather's ship. It works. She catches him, and they all go to court. Unfortunately, George is also on trial. Luckily, Elroy made a tape showing his innocence. The kid really is a genius. Grateful as ever, George promises to believe his son about everything. For his efforts in stopping the crime, George is slapped with a ton of new paperwork. Well, that's gratitude for you. Elroy's latest invention takes center stage in Season 3, Episode 2. This episode opens with Elroy pestering Judy to borrow one of her hair curlers. He wants to use it for one of his inventions, Evolutia. Judy hopes it's better than his last invention, a malfunctioning makeup gun. Elroy wanders into his lab, seeking volunteers to test his invention. No takers. So he tries it on a plant, instantly evolving into a humanoid creature. Then, it tries to lick him. Gross. He tries to test it on himself, but ruh-roh, Astro gets in the way and mutates into a dinosaur-like creature. Right as the machine breaks, Astro is okay, but something is different. He's super intelligent now, and he can talk properly. With the lab testing out of the way, George announces that he's home and whines about work. He barely walks in when the boss calls, telling him there's an emergency at the factory and George needs to fix it, even if he doesn't know how. But George is clueless. But there's some good news. Astro is a super genius with a 4,000 IQ and a bulging brain to boot. He gives George detailed instructions for the repair. Next thing you know, the dog is doing fancy math equations and repairing Rosie the Robot. He's also become kind of a jerk. But good old easily impressed George has a plan to exploit the dog's abilities. Astro seems cool with it, so they go on a ride in George's new souped-up vehicle, but he crashes into work and gets fired. Luckily, his boss offers him the job back if he fixes a new problem that's causing weird cogs to fly off the assembly line. The dog fixes the issue and gives George all the glory. Afterward, they go to a toy shop and solve a Rubik's Cube. The shop owner challenges him to a 3D chess game, but wants to make it interesting. Astro whispers chess moves into George's ear, helping him win. This goes on for a while until George bets his house and life savings on Astro's smarts. Though Astro has been there the entire time, the shopkeeper suddenly decides there are no dogs allowed. But not to worry, George watches Astro's suggestions through the window until the dog catcher gets him. The Jetsons spring Astro from doggy jail, but the ungrateful pooch wants to go be a professor on Saturn. The family is surprisingly cool with it, but not before George convinces the dog to help him win all the money back by going on a popular game show. The next day, George and Astro become contestants. Things go well until Evolutia wears off. They get kicked off the show and go home. Mr. Spacely shows up to offer George a new job as a cookie salesman. Apparently, the cogs from earlier in the episode that went haywire are actually pretty good dog treats. Remember how a few minutes ago they were worried about how they lost everything? Well, the situation fixes itself when Mr. Spacely offers them a new job, a new car, and a new apartment. Nice. His boss asks, "What's so special about this dog anyway?" To which George replies, "Nothing. He's just a plain old ordinary dog." Season 3, Episode 9 is the second to last episode for the series, but works much better than the actual series finale. The Jetsons are sitting at the table enjoying breakfast. Rosie serves pancakes as George gets some good news from Rudy the computer. The office is closed for the week. Now, the family is going to do all the things they wanted to do: clubbing, dancing lessons, fixing a sink, futuristic stuff. Usually, the tiniest amount of work easily overwhelms George, but this time around, everyone's asking him to do a bunch of stuff. He runs his errands, but stops by the office, where he meets with a scientist in a lab, who is working on a cloning formula. The scientist offers George a hit, but he declines and goes about his errands. During the dancing lesson, he learns that his helpful wife signed him up for more dancing lessons and volunteer work at the school. This is a light bulb moment for George, who takes up the scientist's offer on the cloning formula. He arranges to pick it up the next day, and when morning rolls around, they meet in the lab and get George into the wonderful world of cloning. Greedy as ever, Jetson wants his clone to have more knowledge and skill than himself. A fresh George clone comes off the line, and George just loves the freedom that comes with having a clone. Now he can be lazy while his clone works. It turns out the clone is doing a fine job taking care of business. Clone George is better with the dog, better at hockey, and a technical wizard for Judy's band. Better yet, the clone is excited about dancing with Jane. But the real George doesn't like that. And once having a clone becomes inconvenient, he goes back to his science pal to ask for a fix. Luckily, the lab has just the thing, a vanishing spray. But it's dangerous to remove it from the lab. George heads over to the dance studio with a new mission: to catch his doppelganger and bring him back to the lab to be disposed of. He attempts to lure his clone into an animal control vehicle, but gets trapped inside, leaving the clone alone with his wife. They return to the lab with the real George trapped and about to be hit with some vanishing mist. He convinces a few lab monkeys to release him, and they eventually do, allowing George to grab the vanishing gun and head to the apartment. He tries to play a game of cloak and dagger, but keeps running into family members. After a few compliments, he puts the gun away and lets the clone take over his life. He then goes off to join the Foreign Legion, but the scientist and clone track him down. It turns out the clone will disappear shortly, so he'll need to return to his family. In the end, he learns nothing. His clone dissolves, and he gets all the glory from his clone's hard work. Classic George Jetson. The final episode of the Jetsons, Spacely for a Day, opens with George doing what he does best, sleeping at work. But that's when Rudy the supercomputer warns him about a visit from Mr. Spacely. His boss strolls into the room and introduces a new efficiency inspector, who immediately makes this difficult by being picky. The new efficiency inspector brags about how his company can find out if employees are worth keeping around. Turns out that Spacely is cleaning house, and who's first on the chopping block? George Jetson, of course. They go through a series of tests. He has to guess the location of a ball and put a broken robot back together, but he doesn't do well. Upset, he goes home to tell his family about his failure. His family can't resist changing his scores, and when it's time to see the results, George is miraculously at the top. Now he gets to run things while Mr. Spacely takes his wife on vacation. George spends time trying to build his confidence with the help of a holographic program before starting work, and goes over various work stuff with Rudy, but he's clearly confused and hasn't a clue. Come on, George, do what we all do. Fake it until you make it. Cut to Cogswell being excited about putting his chief competitor out of business by setting up a fraudulent cog purchase through George. Get ready for some major problems. He butters George with a game of golf, convincing him to take the bogus order. Naturally, he falls for it and contacts the other company. He accepts an order for 3 million sprockets. The problem is, the buyer's a shell company who doesn't plan to pay. Things go to George's head, and he acts like a jackass to everyone, including his family. But it gets worse. George is rude to existing customers, starts canceling their orders, and his incompetence gets the company into some serious trouble. Spacely sprockets begin rapidly losing customers to Cogswell. To make matters worse, Cogswell manipulates George into doing a bunch of crazy things, like spray chemicals from a tanker all over the Spacely Sprockets building. Before he can do anything too crazy, however, Elroy confesses to changing George's test scores. To put the cherry on top, they discover the chemicals destroy everything they touch, kind of like a toddler left alone for a few seconds. Now, George is mad. He goes after Cogswell, leaving his wife and son to take the noxious chemicals away. They return the tanker to Cogswell's shop, so when he presses the big white button to release the spray, all over his business. On the heels of Cogswell's fall, Mr. Spacely returns from vacation. He's ecstatic about the large sprocket order until he finds out the order came from Universal Galactic Products Unlimited. Apparently, they haven't paid a bill in 25 years. But things look up when Cogswell admits he's nearly out of business and offers to buy the sprockets himself. At a large markup, of course. This delights greedy old Mr. Spacely, causing him to forgive George. The Jetsons is definitely a product of its time. 1960s cultural attitude shaped its first season, and still lingered during the 1980s revival, despite its more kid-friendly vibe. It held on to those original ideas right up until the last episode. But that didn't stop it from branching out into several TV movies. As the series wrapped up in the 80s, Jetsons fever was still sky high, so Hanna-Barbera did something that was pretty common back then. They made a crossover movie. They combined America's favorite prehistoric family with their futuristic counterparts in the Jetsons Meet the Flintstones. But it's more Flintstones than Jetsons. The movie switches back and forth between the two families. In the future, George is having trouble waking up. Elroy gets lucky at breakfast, Rudy, the Spacely Sprockets supercomputer, malfunctions and causes everyone to almost lose their jobs. Cogswell flirts with his own AI and figures out ways to screw over Spacely. In prehistoric times, Fred and Barney are setting up a money-making scheme. They eventually dress up in inappropriate costumes and play poker with their boss. But things do not go well and both of them get fired. Back in the future, and George is eager to relax, which is pretty on brand for him. When they test it, he accidentally sets it to the past, causing the Jetson family to meet the Flintstones. George befriends Fred immediately, with Fred seeing an opportunity to use their technology to impress his boss. The Jetsons and the Flintstones spend some time getting to know one another and get along well. They even go to a rock concert where the lead singer falls in love with Judy. George and Fred work together to help Mr. Slate win some games by using future tech to cheat. It kind of works, but Dino and Astro get in the way. Back in the future, Rosie the Robot helps repair the time machine to retrieve her family. She and the maintenance guy try to figure out how to retrieve the family. Spacely barges in, looking for George and threatening to ruin him. He doesn't believe Rosie when she tells him they're stuck in the past. I mean, would you? In prehistoric Bedrock, everyone tries to fix the time machine, but it doesn't work right, bringing the Flintstones to the future instead. Realizing that the Flintstones are actually cavemen, Mr. Spacely takes advantage of the situation and uses them for marketing. The Flintstones don't adapt well to life in the future, but the Jetsons find jobs in the past. Everyone is miserable. Fortunately, Rosie eventually fixes the time machine for good, travels back in time to retrieve the Jetsons, and everyone is returned to their proper era. The Jetsons take Fred Flintstone's car back to the future with them, which Spacely decides to use to create futuristic copy. Cogswell attempts to steal the information, but fails. By the end of the film, everyone is in a better place. Fred and Barney are friends again, and they get their jobs back. George gets to keep his job for the last time, and the time machine no longer works. And prehistoric cars are just rolling off the assembly line. 1988 brought fans another special, Rockin' with Judy Jetson. It's a bit out there and focuses on Judy's musical misadventures. Basically, she writes an original pop song and gives it to her favorite idol. It becomes a hit. When it does, a villain named Felonia Funk swaps a mind control code for the lyrics. Judy teams up with a band and some music-loving aliens to defeat Felonia with the power of music. It's kind of like this version of The Jetsons was made for MTV fans.
Guy Rocker, I'm me, Billy Booster.
Oh, Billy!
The less said about it, the better. Jetsons the movie came out in 1990, bringing real closure to the series, kind of. The film opens with some major changes in the Jetsons' lives. The world is now full of smog. They eat meals in tablet form instead of real food, and a new Spacey Sprockets facility is being abandoned by its current manager. The first time we see George, he's having trouble waking up and getting into scrapes with a dog. On the way to work, he's in yet another traffic jam. Luckily, he uses a fancy trick to get by quickly. That is, until a real cop shows up to spoil the party. He lazes around at work. Seriously, the guy is basically just leaning in his chair while his boss takes a meeting. Spacely lies to investors about how well the new plan is doing, not realizing something strange is about to unfold. He hops on a conference call with the plant's robot foreman and learns someone appears to be sabotaging things, cutting wires or unplugging machines just as sprockets are rolling off the line. He's not so happy, so he calls his finest employee, George Jetson, and makes him the vice president in charge of the plant. George is delighted, but his family isn't. But they relocate anyway. The family heads to the plant the following day. When they reach their new digs, they find out Rosie's remote works for all their equipment too. Neat. It doesn't take long for everyone to start to adjust to their new life. They meet new robots, receive housewarming gifts, and Judy indulges in self-pity. Elroy even meets a furry green friend and its family. That night, some creatures with glowing eyes skulk through the plant and unplug a bunch of wires. The next day, George finally sees the new plant and panics a bit. While he works, his wife and daughter go to the mall. Judy meets a boy and stops moping. Elroy plays basketball with a robot child. Things seem to be going well at the plant and productivity is very high. Right before hitting the 1 millionth sprocket, the mysterious aliens unplug the machine and cause massive destruction. George gets swept up in the malfunction and injures his finger. The plant gets sabotaged even more, with several machines actually blowing up. George ends up sick in bed. Strange things keep happening at the plant while Judy has a teenage romance that includes an incredibly long, overblown, and extremely 80s, a bad way, musical number. Even with things going poorly, George refuses to shut down operations. Jane begs him to do it, finally telling him no job is worth this much trouble. Spacely blames George for all the glitches, but that doesn't stop him from investigating the issue. He falls asleep while searching the factory and gets kidnapped. Elroy goes looking for his father, discovering the grungy in the process.
Squeak! Can you play with him?
It turns out there are some aliens called the Grungy, whose home is being destroyed by the factory's operations. Judy and her boyfriend band together with Elroy and the Grungy to find their dad. They go to a cavern, where they learn the factory is causing environmental damage. They also find their father bound and gagged on the cavern floor. You know what? I don't even want to know. Spacely doesn't even realize George is missing. He comes to the asteroid and starts putting the plant into overtime, further destroying their home. And you know, he doesn't care. He knew about the Grungy the entire time. The Jetson family help the Grungy stay safe from the damage caused by the plant. Elroy gets hurt, but is okay in the end. The family confronts Mr. Spacely. George grows a backbone, tells him off, and pulls the plug. Dropping his usual greedy antics, he works out an arrangement with the aliens that also allows him to keep his job. Instead of mining and messing up the underground, the Grungies will create the sprockets and Spacely will buy them. That way, everyone is happy with the aliens keeping their habitat and George keeping his fancy new job. Though the movie essentially wrapped up the series, it didn't spell the end of the property. The Jetsons and WWE Robo Wrestlemania hit the scene in 2017. Featuring none of the original cast due to all of them passing away except for Frank Welker, the movie takes place 100 years after a WWE event, and it's pretty unremarkable. Basically, Elroy wakes up a frozen WWE wrestler who tries to take over the future with an army of wrestling robots. The family travels back in time to recruit help from other WWE wrestlers who help end the uprising. It's not a great movie, and in my opinion, it's a lousy send-off for such a classic cartoon. But with all the amazing stories they gave us, we really can't complain. Do you have fond memories of the Jetsons growing up? What's your favorite episode? Let us know in the comments below. I'll catch you in the next one. See ya!